Is this crazy? We stand on the verge of the 4 greatest years in the history of Make America Great Again. How can you be against it?
We're almost 3 months into President Trump's second term. And if you've been following along with us here on our show, also with all the other coverage at the Washington Post, you know it's been almost 3 months of very loud, in-your-face policy implementation. Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Rhonda Colvin here with my colleagues, James Hohmann and JM Rieger. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Today, we're looking at the strategy and if there is one out of the White House. I know that's a question that I've gotten a lot from friends, other journalists, like, what's the end game here? We'll be talking about some of the behind the scenes of some of the more chaotic moments in Trump's first 85 days. I believe today is day 85 of the Trump administration. And we're going to try to figure out, is this the administration's approach to policy? Is this it? Or is there really a game plan? So let's start from this weekend. There was an article in the Post, and the headline was, Trump is pursuing a radical agenda. Does he have a strategy, or is he just winging it? I thought this was a very compelling question. What do you guys think?
Discuss, yeah.
Yes, let's discuss this. And this was a story written by Dan Baltz, one of our, esteemed colleagues here at the Washington Post. What do you guys think? Is Trump pursuing this radical agenda in a way that suggests there is a strategy, or is he just winging it?
I think that the administration, above all else, wants to give the appearance of action sort of at all times. There was kind of this famous anecdote, and if you will, from Trump's first term in 2017, where there was some reporting that Trump was telling aides to think of every single day as a TV show, as an individual episode, to keep folks attached, to keep them tuned in. And I think some of what we're seeing out of the White House is that. I also think some of what we're seeing out of the White House is sort of a comeback next week approach, right? There is we're going to do this, but maybe it's a negotiation, maybe it's not, maybe it evolves into a negotiation, and contradictions are almost sort of baked into the whole pie, if you will.
Sometimes he's crazy. Sometimes he's crazy like a fox. I think that there often is more of a method to the madness than we appreciate. I do think that James absolutely right. It is that you feel like he's doing something and you want the president, a lot of his supporters want to feel like the president is taking action, isn't just like whining about how he's constrained by Congress, but it's sort of like using the powers of the presidency to put points on the board. I do think he has, he wasn't intending to blink on the tariffs last week. That was him responding to Jamie Dimon on Fox. It was him responding to the bond markets. And so some of it is improvisational. He's sort of like on the fly, and underlying it is this genuinely held belief that this is something he really wants to do. But then he sort of, I think a lot of what Trump does is testing boundaries and pushing limits. He's like, what can he get away with? And sometimes I think he pushes buttons to see if he gets a rise out of people. And if he doesn't, he keeps pushing. And that he kind of has this almost like an improv comedian willingness to float something and then back away from it. And so I think also Trump does subscribe to the madman theory of foreign policy, which is the idea that he wants people to think he is actually crazy enough to do stuff like what he did on tariffs, that he's actually crazy enough that he would bomb Tehran unless they, give up uranium. And so, I mean, it got people to the table, right? I mean, it did sort of work. The problem is when you're trying to conjure that sort of vibe where people are terrified of you, you do have to sort of act irrationally sometimes. But I think that in some ways you don't want to like put a gloss of like rationality to things that aren't totally rational. And I do think that that's one of the things that's watching conservative TV. There's all these people who are like, oh no, this is totally like everything that's happening is exactly as Trump planned. And this was completely the plan all along. And that's obviously bunk.
One thing I've been thinking about is in the last 85 days is when comparing it to the last administration, he did, at least early on in the last administration, he did have more Republican establishment people, if you will, people who had already worked in government, White House lawyers who were familiar with laws of governing. He had them around him. This time, are we seeing any sense that there are people in his orbit who do have his ear, who can sort of, hem him in when he does, make a big step or controversial move?
I think the theory is like he has more loyalists around him this time, and in some ways similar to his first term with different kind of episodes that happened. If you were too dissenting, then you sort of got ousted essentially, right? And I think we're seeing kind of echoes of that this time. I also think that, their theory of the case, in a sense, they being the Trump administration, is that they do have a lot of political capital. They have this huge mandate, even though it was a really narrow election victory. We see this often with presidents where they try and push like how much of a mandate they have, but I think we're seeing Trump push that even further here. And I also think that, again, hearkening back to his first term, we are seeing echoes of infrastructure week. We are seeing echoes of the effort to repeal Obamacare, where Trump is expending a lot of political capital. I don't know that he necessarily thinks that he has a limitless supply, but I think he thinks that he has a lot of capital. That's why they keep talking about this is a mandate. This is what the American people voted for when they talk about these things. And with that mindset, that helps explain some of the approach that they're taking, where, to James's point, they're going to push different buttons and see how much of a rise they might get or see how much pushback they might get because they think their capital and their mandate is so high. The risk for them is that we're already starting to see in some polling kind of approval levels dip down for Trump personally on some of these specific policies are very underwater. So that is the risk for them, because they are in basically a 12 to 18 month stretch here to really get stuff done legislatively, to really get stuff done on a more permanent basis than these kind of executive actions that he's taking. And once you pass that kind of time frame, you're fully into midterm election season, and then rubber hits the road.
Yeah, James, I remember during the campaign season, a lot of people were focusing on Susie Wiles, saying she was sort of that Trump whisperer. Now she's chief of staff. Is she a person who may be keeping him in line a little bit, helping him reverse some of these moves that aren't really playing well in the public?
Susie is doing a fantastic job of keeping the trains running on time. But where the trains are running, I think she's leaving up to Trump. I don't think she is pushing like a certain direction the way a chief of staff normally might. I really think she sees herself as an honest broker who's helping make sure that, unlike in the first term where the president often did the thing that the last person he talked to before he made the decision recommended to him, I think this time she's trying to ensure that there's more of a process where everyone feels like they're getting heard. So it's not just Peter Navarro in the driver's seat, but Peter Navarro and Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. And she's making sure that they're all sort of like in the room and that the president is hearing all of their perspectives. So by all accounts, when you talk to people internally, she's actually very beloved. People sort of talk about her. She's old enough to be a grandma, but really like a maternal figure. She's admired. Unlike, in Trump world, there's obviously people who always, want to knife someone. And in my interactions, like people from all the different factions inside Trump world sort of respect Susie. And that's in part because they see her as this honest broker who's willing to make sure, that their voice is heard. On the other hand, one of the things that people were able to do in the first term when he had more sort of traditional adults in the room was that they would prevent Trump from hearing from the so-called crazies, in their words. And so, but this time she still can't keep Laura Loomer away. Laura Loomer, 9/11 denier, really kind of very out there, was able to get a meeting with the president on the same day that he announced all the tariffs, so-called Liberation Day. And Trump fired a bunch of people on the National Security Council. He fired the head of the NSA. And that was because Susie, while in control, still can't control sort of the id of the Trump, the MAGA universe, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and I think there's also two parts of this whole thing too, of in terms of how you look at it. How effective has Trump been amid kind of the chaos that we've had, the reversals, right? I think there's one view here where he's actually been very effective, and meaning he has a lot of control and oversight of the federal government, and they are doing what they want to do, which is undermining key parts, laying off vast swaths of the federal government to really reshape that, and that's having real tangible impacts already. Right, whether it's things not working or whether it's a different mission at this government agency or that government agency. I think the other way of looking at Trump's first, 85 days here or so is he's been very ineffective, right? The tariffs, he's been all over the place. Deportations, while he's done a lot of high profile ones and kind of stoked fear in kind of the public, if you will, the numbers of deportations overall are way down, right? There's a variety of reasons for that. And
hasn't passed signature legislation.
Hasn't passed any legislation signature, right? And that stuff, and Rhonda, you know better than anyone, but that stuff is very much on the rocks, right? They do not have a clear path forward of how they're going to get this reconciliation package, which is that kind of tax cut, immigration stuff that they want to do. They don't still have a clear path at this point how they're going to get that through. That doesn't mean it won't get through later this year, but right now there's still a lot to figure out.
Crazy stat. It feels like Trump's been president for a long time. He's not even 4% done with his term, right? Yeah. But I mean, James, absolutely right. There's a 12-month, 18-month, if you're generous, window, and if the polls start turning against you, the markets and the economy start turning against you, then things get a lot harder. They have a very narrow majority in the House, but he has 95% of the term left, which is sort of a remarkable thing to think about.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the part where the beginning is when you really set the tone and everything, but it's perspective that's easy to forget when we're working 7 days a week.
And it's also remarkable because he's already done this once.
Right.
So the fact that they're already having so many stumbles, right? The narrative going in was sort of, he's got loyalists around him, but he's got people who know how to kind of pull the levers of government. But they've had stumble after stumble, reversal after reversal, and we're not even 100 days in yet.
Some of that's by design, though, right? I mean, some of it is, that's testing the limits. Stephen Miller and Russ Vought and others spent the last 4 years coming up with all these plans, Project 2025, which actually did turn out to be pretty much a blueprint. And all these executive orders Trump is signing every day, a lot of them they knew they would get challenged in court and beaten back. But it is if 25% of it sticks, you've fundamentally remade the executive power.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because I've also been thinking about how he did get a shot at this presidency thing, for 4 years. And back then I remember people from, Trump world saying, well, we didn't really know how things worked and, we had to figure things out as we went along. Now they should know how things work. So it almost feels like if there is a strategy, chaos can be a strategy. They are aware of how government works. And you're right. We do have reporting where people in his orbit spent the last 4 years trying to figure out how to expand presidential power, how to get around, ways that Congress would typically be standing in front of the executive branch. But you guys mentioned tariffs, and I want to kind of drill into that and how that sort of illustrates a little bit of this chaotic strategy or no strategy, who knows? But I wanted to read you some polling from this week from YouGov and CBS News. This was a poll taken from April 8th through the 11th. And it says that 58% of Americans say they oppose the new tariffs on goods. So 58%, that likely includes some Republicans, right? But when you look at party line questions, on the question of does Trump have a clear plan for tariffs and trade, 91% of Republicans said yes, he does. 16% of Democrats said he does. So overwhelmingly, Republicans seem to be waiting this out. Is that our read on this?
It's a really interesting observation. I think because we spend a lot of time, especially you up on the Hill, thinking about congressional Republicans and what congressional Republicans are saying. But in terms of the actual rank and file, it's a really interesting thought experiment. John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, is out there saying when reporters ask about the tariffs, well, you all know how I feel about the tariffs. He doesn't say y'all because he's from South Dakota, but you all know how I feel about the tariffs, and which means he's against them. But he's not pretending that he's for them, but he's also not opposing them. And I think that is a reflection probably of where the rank and file Republican is in South Dakota, where it is actually a state very dependent on agriculture, exports, but they want to give Trump a chance. They're willing to sort of like go along with what they sort of know to not be an economic strategy that has ever before worked.
I think that helps explain why Republicans have been broadly muted on the tariffs. They will speak up a little bit around the edges, but for example, there's no real tangible plan at this point. I know that they're trying to work on a vote to pull back on some of his emergency authorities on this, to pull back the tariffs. But that at this point does not have prospects of passing, right? And even if it did, Trump would veto it, and they definitely don't have a veto-proof majority to overturn the veto. Even though a lot of Republicans in Congress don't support, especially in the Senate, do not support these tariffs, right? And if you talk to them privately, they would say as much, right? But to James' point, they also would say, we're going to give the president some time. And that is reflective of, I think, where the base of the party is at. I think there's a part of this where Trump is saying, what he's been saying consistently for 30 or 40 years has been widely covered at this point, which is trade deficits, reimagining the economy, putting us back into kind of a post-World War II industrialized economy, kind of a mercantilist vision of the economy. And you hear folks like Howard Lutnick say, yeah, we'll get to a point where we can eliminate the IRS because we'll be pulling in so much money in tariffs, right? But
wish they would have done that before I sent in my taxes.
Right. Would have been good to know. I mean, but all of this is, again, there are inherent contradictions to all of this, whether is it a negotiation? Is it not a negotiation? Are we trying to reshore everything, or are we trying to use tariffs to eliminate the IRS and the income tax, right? Are we using this because we want to devalue the dollar so that we bring down our debt payments? Or are we trying to stay as the reserve currency de facto of the world, right? And they have talked both privately and publicly about all of these different components of this. And depending on which administration official you get, they'll tell you one thing or they'll tell you the other thing. Some of that is because the White House maybe doesn't have a clear strategy internally on this, but some of this, I think, they don't view these as mutually exclusive, right? Whether it's a negotiation or it's not, for example. And so I do
pretty generous to them.
Yes, but that's what they would say,
yeah,
right?
Right?
And I think that is their theory of the case, at least on tariffs. Now, obviously, the overwhelming number of economists completely disagree with them, but that is what the White House is saying.
And tribalism is a hell of a drug. I mean, it is like this 90% stat. It really is amazing listening to some conservative podcasts. It's sort of like, oh, Trump is so absolutely right on the reciprocal tariffs, and like he's not going to back down. And then the next day he does, and they're like, oh, it's the art of the deal. Like Trump is the master deal maker. This was always the play, and they're like, people are just like, so many people in our society feel such a strong pull to put on a red jersey or a blue jersey, right? And like that, I think, is what's happening with tariffs. Yeah. Growing up, I mean, I'm not that old, but like growing up, I remember when like the standard bearer of the Republican Party was Paul Ryan, Mr. like free markets, free people. And like, it was just kind of like a dogma. It was like just as a given that tariffs were a terrible idea. And now it's Trump's party and they're like following Trump's lead, and like he's the boss, and they're, it's kind of amazing to watch because it's like a lot of the same people. And there are some people who deserve some credit for intellectual honesty, like Ted Cruz is out there still criticizing the tariffs because he's more of a traditional markets guy. But you have others who are like happy to sort of follow along.
Yeah, I think that raises a really good point, because it is really interesting to watch how it's sort of, politicians often read the room. They read, the public. Now they're just reading the White House and seeing how they should frame their responses around what Trump is doing. And we know his press secretary said last week, just trust him. And it seems like that is what, Republicans on the ground are feeling, as well as congressional Republicans. And I'll also add this too. I don't know if you guys saw this clip last week, but the U.S. Trade Representative was on the Hill. I was there the day he was in front of the Senate, but he also went in front of the House. While he was in front of the House, the news comes that the tariffs are going to be paused while he's in the middle of his testimony. And it was just remarkable to see him say, well, I guess we're going to do this. And this is the determination made by the White House. And there was one Democrat that pushed back on him saying, how did you not know this? You're the U.S. Trade Representative. But he quickly fell in line. He did not deviate and quickly seemed very supportive, even though his aide had to come to him showing him the news that we were all learning. So it is interesting to be in, cover politics where we're now seeing, politicians just follow Trump and whatever he is saying and doing versus perhaps the people back at home, the constituents.
It is like a reality TV show, right? I mean, that scene where Jameson Greer is sitting there and he gets a note and then just on a dime changes his testimony.
Right. And I do have a one last question on the tariffs issue. What about the Democrats' messaging on this? Because it seems like it is an opportunity politically to go after Trump on this. If it's not popular with the American public, and you have moments where people in the administration are learning along with the rest of us about the future of tariffs, isn't this an opportunity for Democrats to have a strong message? And are they presenting a strong message right now?
I think that they're trying to walk a tightrope on this, because I do think the tariffs have been linked with this is going to help blue collar manufacturing jobs, which is dubious depending on which economist you talk to. Maybe that's generous as well, but we lost factory jobs net in Trump's first term, even though we had tariffs in, now at a smaller scale, right? But Democrats do not want to necessarily come across, you see folks like Gretchen Whitmer, as going against manufacturing interests, for example, factory workers, things like that, but simultaneously are trying to make this argument that it's actually going to harm you. Like, you have to do sort of a full court press on that to make that argument and come across. And I think what we're seeing from Democrats is kind of struggling to find kind of a simple through line message on that, other than, broadly saying tariffs are bad. The other problem for Democrats, though, which is the problem that they run into all the time, their power is very, very limited right now. They do not have, they can pull some levers, and there's going to be, another shutdown fight. There's going to be a reconciliation fight later this year. So those are really kind of the pressure points, but they don't have a ton of leverage. And I think, depending on what he does or doesn't do, he being Trump, on these tariffs, again, 12, 18 months from now when we're at midterm time, that's where we're really going to see, I think, the effect of these and how much folks are or not feeling the tariffs at that point.
Yeah, I want to move on to another area of Trump policy, and it's been the deportations. There have been a few high-profile cases at this point. There was the Tufts student who had a hearing this week. There are now 2 Palestinian students from Columbia University who have been detained. Mass deportations, they were a campaign promise. I remember at the RNC, there were people holding up signs saying more mass deportations. So is his handling of these high-profile cases a part of a campaign promise, or is it just chaotic and he's just going along with how judges are ruling?
He had a mandate for mass deportations. He did run on it. He didn't have a mandate for this. He didn't have a mandate for deporting people who are barred from judges' orders from being removed to El Salvador. I don't think the people who kind of were waving those mass deportations now signs wanted to exclude Turkish international students at elite universities. I don't think that that's what people were voting for. I think he's sort of picked this fight. He's sort of happy to have this fight where he wants Democrats to look like they're defending MS-13, even though a lot of these people, it seems pretty clear, are not MS-13 that are in this maximum security prison in El Salvador. But Trump thinks this is a winning fight for him. But I think one of the scary things he said in the Oval Office was when he was meeting with El Salvador President Bukele, was that he wants to be able to send U.S. citizens there for prison as well, which is very chilling. And there's this man in Maryland, and it seems pretty clear that he was not a gang member. He came to the United States in 2011 as a teenager after this Barrio 18 gang in El Salvador shook down his mom, who owned a pupusa shop in the small town where he grew up, for protection money. She declined to pay. Then they tried to recruit him and said, if you don't join, we're going to hurt your family. So the family fled from El Salvador to Maryland. And he was picked up by ICE while he was standing outside of Home Depot trying to get work in 2019. He's wearing a Chicago Bulls hat. And absurdly, the Prince George's County Police say, well, there's a sect of MS-13 in New York State, and they wear Chicago Bulls gear. And so this guy is clearly part of MS-13. That was their main evidence.
That was it, yeah.
And so now, he's MS-13 member, but he goes to court, and a judge denied his asylum claim, but said he has reasonable fear of being killed if he goes back to El Salvador. So ruled that he can't be sent to El Salvador. The administration knows that this is the case. They make what they acknowledge was an administrative error and send him back. And now they won't lift a finger to get him back, even though the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that the administration must facilitate his return. And they're saying, well, facilitate is different than effectuate. And, they're quibbling, but they're sort of defying the spirit of this Supreme Court order. And they're trying to make it about, foreign policy. But this is really about the rule of law. It's not about immigration.
I will also add, it does seem like when it comes to deportations, there may be a strategy, a very specific one, when it comes to higher ed. I mentioned the 2 Palestinian students from Colombia. There have been others. We know that Harvard just made a decision not to comply with some of the Trump administration demands when it comes to, getting their funding. And I looked it up. There are more than 50 schools right now under investigation from the Department of Ed. And these are not all Ivy League schools. These are, I have in front of me, there's Duke, Montana State University, University of Colorado, University of Cincinnati, University of Kentucky. So many schools now are trying to weigh whether or not to comply with what Trump wants them to do. Is there a strategy when it comes to specifically looking at higher ed and trying to dismantle it or trying to affect it in a way that bends toward how Trump sees education?
The through line on Trump is he often governs to his base and for the support of that. And these actions on the higher education front are it's a lot of culture war stuff from Trump and from the Trump administration. These threats, the claims they're making are, the generous way of putting it is they're being challenged in court, but legally dubious, a lot of this, right? And similar to what James was just talking about with some of these visa deportation revoking that's going on. And the same thing we're seeing, I think, with these universities and the Trump's approach. And again, this all gets back to what we were talking about off the top here, which is there's kind of a chaos, invoke kind of max uncertainty. They think that's giving them leverage / giving them at least the appearance of action, the appearance of effectuating change. And I think that's what we're seeing on the higher ed front as well.
I think just a last observation on immigration, and then I'll pivot back, is one of the numbers our colleagues, Maria Sacchetti and someone else, Good, had a piece on the front page of Sunday's newspaper that said 1 million people is how many people they want to deport. So I think some of it is just numbers. They're trying to hit 1 million. Mm-hmm. On Harvard, Trump's base, it is culture war. James, absolutely right. Trump's base identifies academia, not just Ivy Leagues, but academia with the left. And I think over the last few years, academia didn't necessarily do themselves any favor by being a center of the post-October 7th protests against Israel. But there is this perception among Trump's base, they want a fighter, and Trump is fighting, that Trump's enemies are their enemies. Mm. And, and it's interesting because these are all individual institutions that have their own constituencies to worry about. But like Columbia basically tried to play ball with Trump and make an agreement and get a deal so that they didn't lose all their federal money. And Harvard has taken the opposite tack, which is like, no, Harvard published the list of demands that the Trump people sent them on Friday and said, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to fight you. Harvard's the richest school in the country. They can sort of afford to do it. But if you're Montana State University, it's a lot harder to go to war with Trump because you're not going to have donors backfill. You don't have a $60 billion endowment. And so I think a lot of people on the left are happy that Harvard is picking this fight because they can sort of be the heat shield, and maybe it'll embolden others to also not just roll over for the administration.
All right. Well, James, JM, thank you so much. And you, our listeners and viewers, can watch us again on Thursday, where we will be back with another episode of Sidebar. I'm Rhonda Colvin for The Washington Post. Have a good day.